She refused to sit next to a Trump supporter on a plane. What happened next left the whole cabin stunned. The airport was packed. People rushed past, dragging wheeled suitcases, their faces set in quiet determination. Some clutched coffee cups, others stared at their phones, barely aware of their surroundings. It was just another day at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Until it wasn't. Among the passengers waiting to board Flight 2723 to Dallas was a woman in her late 40s, auburn hair in a neat ponytail, crisp blazer, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She looked every bit the polished professional, sharp, efficient, accustomed to being in control. But beneath the composed exterior, a restless energy simmered. She had a long day ahead. 2 meetings back to back, followed by a dinner with potential investors. The last thing she needed was an uncomfortable flight. When her boarding group was called, she exhaled, rolling her shoulders before stepping forward. The line moved swiftly, and within minutes, she was inside the aircraft, maneuvering down the narrow aisle toward 23A, her window seat. A quick glance ahead told her the plane was already filling up. Then she saw him. Seat 23B right next to hers. A middle-aged man, maybe early 50s, slightly overweight, dressed casually in jeans and a navy hoodie. But that wasn't what made her pause. It was the bright red cap sitting atop his head. Trump 2024. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She hadn't even sat down yet, and already her heart was racing. But she told herself to breathe. It was just a hat, right? She slid into her seat, carefully placing her laptop bag under the seat in front of her. The man beside her didn't look up. He was scrolling through his phone, relaxed, oblivious to the tension settling in beside him. She shifted, crossing her legs, then uncrossing them. The window felt smaller than usual, the air slightly warmer. Her gaze flickered to his hat again, bright red, bold white letters. A statement, whether he intended it to be or not. A quiet sigh slipped past her lips. Not here. Not now. She had no energy for this. She just wanted a smooth flight, a few uninterrupted hours before landing in Dallas. But she couldn't ignore it. Her arms folded tightly across her chest as she muttered, just loud enough for herself, "Of course." The man finally looked up, catching the tail end of her exasperation. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, just went back to his phone. She glanced around. The aisle seat next to them was still open. Maybe someone she could tolerate would take it. Someone who didn't think that way. Passengers continued boarding. A man in a suit, a woman with a toddler, a group of college students joking loudly. The plane was filling up. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are expecting a full flight today. Please ensure all carry-ons are stowed properly and take your assigned seat as quickly as possible." The seat next to them. Taken. No way out. She swallowed hard. The pilot's voice crackled overhead, welcoming passengers. But all she could focus on was the hat. She pressed her lips together, trying to ignore the growing irritation creeping up her spine. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she could just focus on her emails, put in her headphones, and get through the next 2 hours. But then, the man adjusted in his seat, leaning back with a satisfied sigh, completely at ease. Like he belonged. Like he had no idea, or maybe didn't care, what that hat represented to people like her. Her fingers tapped against her armrest. She couldn't let this go. A flight attendant passed by, helping someone a few rows ahead with overhead storage. She turned in her seat slightly, flagging the woman down. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a polite smile. "Is there any chance I could switch seats? Maybe an aisle seat?" The flight attendant, a blonde in her early 30s with a tired but pleasant expression, glanced at her boarding pass. "I can check, but we're completely full today. Any reason you need to move?" She hesitated for a split second before lowering her voice. I don't feel comfortable sitting here." The attendant's brow furrowed. "Is there an issue?" She swallowed, keeping her voice neutral. "I'd just prefer not to sit next to him." The man beside her slowly turned his head. He wasn't scrolling anymore. He studied her for a moment before speaking, his voice calm, measured. "Is there a reason why?" She let out a small, humorless laugh. You really don't know? He didn't flinch. No, I really don't. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. That hat, she said, voice tight. It represents everything wrong with this country. It stands for racism, sexism, everything She stopped herself, shaking her head. I just don't feel safe. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, I understand, but he hasn't done anything. Yet, she cut in. Passengers nearby were beginning to notice. A few heads turned, eyes flicking between them. The air in the cabin felt thicker now, charged. The man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. I'm just sitting here, lady. She ignored him, looking back at the flight attendant. So, there's nothing you can do? The attendant offered an apologetic smile. Unless there's an actual issue, I can't move you. Her face flushed. This wasn't how she wanted this to go, but she wasn't going to back down. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't just about switching seats anymore. This was about the principle of it. She took a breath, straightened in her seat, and spoke louder, loud enough for more people around them to hear. So, I just have to sit here? Next to someone who openly supports a man who has made life worse for so many people? A few murmurs rippled through the rows nearby. Some passengers glanced over, curious. Others buried their faces deeper into their books or phones, pretending not to hear. The flight attendant's expression tightened. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. But she wasn't finished. This is unacceptable, she said, shaking her head. I have a right to feel safe on this flight. The man beside her let out a short breath, somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. Safe? From what? Sitting next to someone who disagrees with you? She whipped her head toward him. I don't have to explain myself to you. By now the flight crew was watching. A male attendant near the front of the plane whispered something to another staff member. Ma'am, the blonde attendant tried again, firmer this time. I'm asking you to calm down. Passengers nearby were fully invested now. A woman across the aisle gave the man a sympathetic glance. A younger guy a few rows back had his phone out, recording. She noticed and felt a spark of validation. Good. People needed to see this. They needed to understand what she was being forced to put up with. The man sighed and looked toward the front. Look, if it'll make her stop, I'll switch seats with someone. But the flight attendant shook her head. I'm sorry, sir, but we really don't have any open seats. The man turned back toward her. Well, looks like we're stuck with each other, huh? The way he said it, calm, unbothered, it sent her over the edge. I refuse to sit here, she snapped, yanking off her seatbelt. I'm not doing this. The flight attendant took a step back. Ma'am, find me another seat, or I'm getting off this plane. A heavy silence filled the cabin. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. The blonde attendant exhaled, then turned to her colleague. After a brief exchange, she looked back at her. Ma'am, I need you to come with me. She blinked. What? If you refuse to take your seat, we'll have to ask you to deboard. Her stomach twisted. That wasn't supposed to happen. But now, all eyes were on her. She had a choice to make. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was the one being wronged, yet they were treating her like the problem. She looked around the cabin, hoping to find some support, someone who would speak up, nod in agreement, validate her frustration. Nothing. Some passengers were avoiding eye contact. Others watched with interest, their faces unreadable. The young guy with the phone? Still recording. She turned back to the flight attendant. Are you serious? The blonde woman didn't flinch. Ma'am, this is your last chance. Either you take your seat and remain calm, or we'll have to escort you off the plane. She clenched her fists. Escort me? The man beside her sighed and leaned back, adjusting his seatbelt. He hadn't said much since the last exchange, but now he muttered, Unbelievable. That did it. She shot up from her seat, grabbing her bag in jerky, furious movements. Fine, she hissed. I won't sit next to some ignorant bigot anyway. The flight attendant stepped aside, gesturing toward the front of the plane. A male attendant was already waiting, ready to lead her off. She stormed down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor. And then, it started. A slow, scattered clap, She turned, stunned. One man, then another. A few more. A ripple of applause spread through the cabin. Some passengers just smirked, shaking their heads. A woman a few rows ahead rolled her eyes and muttered, "About time." Her face burned. She opened her mouth, but what was there to say? They were all against her. The man in 23B, still seated, gave a small shrug. Not smug, not triumphant, just done with it. She wanted to yell, to defend herself, to explain that she was the one standing up for what was right. But the moment was gone. The flight attendant gave her a pointed look. With one last huff, she turned on her heel and marched off the plane. But she had no idea what was coming next. She barely made it to the terminal before pulling out her phone, hands still shaking with frustration. This had to be addressed. She needed to control the narrative before someone else did. She opened Twitter and started typing. Just got kicked off a flight for refusing to sit next to a Trump supporter. Unbelievable. This is what America has come to. She hit send, heart pounding, waiting for the outrage to roll in. But before she could even refresh her notifications, her phone buzzed with a text. "Have you seen the video?" Her stomach dropped. She flipped to her social media feed, and there it was. A video, already gaining thousands of views, captioned, "Liberal woman freaks out on plane, gets kicked off while passengers cheer." Her mouth went dry as she clicked play. It started right when she called the man a bigot. The angle wasn't great, but the audio was crystal clear. The calm way he had responded, the patience in the flight attendant's voice, and worst of all, the clapping, the passenger's reaction at the end. The comments were brutal. She wanted tolerance but can't even tolerate someone sitting next to her. She's the one who sounds unhinged. That guy was just minding his own business. Entitlement at its finest. She tried to breathe, to push down the panic rising in her chest. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. They were supposed to be on her side. She scrolled through her own tweet. Instead of support, the replies were flooded with mocking gifs, sarcasm, and people reposting the video under her own post. She exited the app, locking her phone with a trembling hand. Back at the gate, through the glass window, she could see the plane still sitting on the tarmac. That man, the one who ruined her entire day, was probably sitting there, perfectly fine, about to take off for Dallas without a care in the world. Her fingers hovered over her phone again. Should she say something? Defend herself? Try to explain? But the damage was already done. And for the first time in a long time, she had no control over what happened next. She sat there staring at her phone screen, watching the numbers climb. Retweets, shares, comments piling up faster than she could read them. It was too late. There was no walking this back, no explaining her side in a way that would make people listen. She could delete her post, but the internet had already seized it. The video was everywhere. Her heart pounded as she flipped to her messages. A friend had texted, "What the hell happened? You're all over the news." She switched over to a news app. Front page, headlines twisting the story, taking the worst moments, making her look unhinged, irrational, everything she swore she wasn't. She wanted to scream. All she had wanted was a different seat. And now, she was the latest viral outrage. She looked around the terminal, but no one paid her any attention. People were moving on with their day. Her entire world had just collapsed, but for them, it was just another headline. She exhaled sharply, locked her phone, and sat there, completely still. For the first time, she wondered if she should have just let it go. And that's the thing about moments like this. They spiral. They take on a life of their own. One decision, one reaction, and suddenly, you're not the one telling the story anymore. Someone else is. Was she right to be upset? Was she justified in how she handled it? Or did she let her emotions get the best of her? Let me know what you think in the comments. Would you have handled this differently? And if you don't want to miss more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.